Welcome back, biological anthropology lecture students. Here we are. This is the last lecture for the week of 3/23. So I hope you finished the material on species and speciation. And if you have any questions, of course, about that stuff, just hit me up with an email. I'm there for you. All right. Now, what we're going to be talking about now is actually entering the Cenozoic era. That's sort of a description of what happened paleoclimatically during the Cenozoic en route to actual primate evolution, which we're going to really begin to talk more seriously about next week. This one's sort of a cursory sort of lecture on, what's probably driving primate evolution, what we really think, and eventually even human evolution. So what I want you to look at now is a chart that I have posted, and it should, be a few things down. And it says the 65 million years of climate change, right? And pay attention to the green line on that chart. That tracks the actual temperature of the Earth over 65 million years. Now, we can get more refined data than that in specific locations, and I'll tell you why. Well, first of all, let me tell you how we get this data. That green line is really tracking the relative ratio of oxygen 18 in the ocean water. And this is what I mean. There's two forms of oxygen in water. One's is a isotope O18 and one's O16. O18 is heavier than O16. So when water evaporates, more O16 is in water vapor. And of course, the water vapor gets dragged across continents in clouds and it rains down. And if it's nice and warm, that O18 enriched water flows right back to the ocean, therefore, maintaining, a relatively higher percentage of O16 that would normally be there. Okay. Now, what would happen though if the Earth was really cold? The water would evaporate, go over the oceans, over the continents, would snow down most likely, and get caught in large ice sheets. And less O16 would be flowing back into the oceans, therefore the ocean would be enriched in O18. So how we can tell if the ocean is enriched in O18 and the world is warmer or colder is that we can take fossilized marine organisms, right? And these marine organisms who build shells utilize calcium carbonate and they draw in ocean water, right? To mix with the calcium to produce the carbonates of their shells. And so we can tell the ratio between O18 and O16 in their shells. So we know, how cold it was or how warm it was, in other words, in the oceans at the time in which we find that philosopher's level, and we can actually date them. And that's tracking that, okay? So we can do that and average the entire Earth's climate, or we can do it just around specific continental margins if we really want to get a really keen view or more accurate view. This is the overall, which still speaks for a lot of the world. Okay, so let's notice that it starts out much warmer, and then we ramp up about 50 million years ago to what's known as the Eocene thermal optimum. If you see, and if you look way over at year zero down here, we're not at the bottom. We just melted out of the last ice age. So we're near where it says -3 up there. But if you compare it to where it was back in the Eocene, you're talking 12 degrees centigrade. That's a lot of temperature. It really is a lot of temperature difference. So the world was much warmer and it was wetter at the beginning of the Cenozoic. The general trend for the Cenozoic is cooling and drying. That's the general trend, with a lot of exceptions. One of the exceptions happens at 34 million years ago. And you can see on the chart there, it says Antarctic glaciation. That event where it drops really suddenly, maybe, 4 degrees centigrade across the world, happened incredibly fast and disturbed many, many ecosystems, wiping out 50% of all species on Earth. That's a pretty conservative estimate, actually. So it wasn't a mass extinction, it was a pulse extinction. But it had a lot to do with primates. Previous to that 34 million year mark, there were 36 taxon of primates, or so running around, 35 at least, and we probably 36. Then after that, there's only 5 taxa of primates left. And they actually represent all of the primate groups that are with us today. Us anthropoids, humans, apes, and monkeys, anthropoids, tarsiers, which we'll look at, lemurs, lorises, and Galagos bush babies. That's it. That's all the larger groups. Of course, they're populated with different species. But it was that one event right there. Those events, too, drive other things. They eliminate many of the specialists and procure sort of the generalists through time. So there's a tendency in primates to become more generalistic in their behavior. Now, you can see this more specifically, these sort of oscillations beginning about 8 million years ago. Notice the green line, how much it's going up and down rapidly. Those transitions were actually very hard on mammalian populations and all populations. If you were in right here near DVC, 10,000 years ago, you see saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, a completely different population of mammals than you see today because they've gone extinct because of the quick turnaround in climate. What does it take to survive that turnaround? That's us, right? The journalists, the adaptable ones. And if there's anything that I can say, that if those transitions did not happen precisely as they did happen during the Cenozoic, know you, know me. Okay? So we have to sort of learn out why they're occurring, not just they did, but why they're occurring. All right. So one we had to do is get at this. A couple of factors are working here. One are biological factors. As we're rebounding from a mass extinction 66 million years ago, biomass increases, CO2 increases in the atmosphere, and we're going to get a little bit of warming because of that. But that shouldn't have caused that massive pulse that we see 50 million years ago. Two other factors come to play. The first is tectonics, the movements of actual continents around the world, right? The actual spreading of continents, right? Which are going to change global ocean flows and then global wind flows and directions, right? And that has had a huge impact on the climate of the Cenozoic. Those specific transitions in continent movements have a lot to do with sort of primate sort of evolution, and I don't want to get into that until Tuesday. We're going to hit that up on Tuesday really big. But in the meantime, there's one other factor that's major in this, and they're called Milankovitch cycles. And those are actual changes in the way that Earth orbits. The way it spins, right, on an axis is degrees, where it's at, and also the eccentricity, the orbit around the sun, slightly elliptical to more spherical around. Milankovitch cycles explain a lot of what we're looking at in these graphs. Now, I have a reading for that. Right below that graph, you're going to see a paper, and it's done by Veronica Guerra, called Milankovitch Theory as a Mechanism for Cenozoic Climate Oscillations. That's one of your major readings to have done before next Tuesday. Okay? Now, other than that, here's what we have to sort of look at also. Another major factor, and when we're talking about, I said the CO2 is rising because the biomass was increasing. Yes, and that biomass was particularly sort of directed at the evolution of flowering plants. Okay, and there's a reading by Lauren Isley. I may have started to ask you guys to read that before this catastrophe, the coronavirus hit, but that's one we want to do, so there's a link to it. I want you to read that to figure out how these flowering plants, these angiosperms, not only transformed the world for organisms, right? All the other organisms, and created a vast and wide structured ecosystems that we see today, but how primates fit into that, right? So Lauren Ives is going to talk a little bit about how primates fit into that. So that's a very important one for you to get. So important that I've included some study questions for it, right? There's a PDF. Now, these study questions, I'm not going to grade. These are not something for you to turn in, but because the next exam is going to have some very specific stuff about Lauren Isley on it, I want to make sure you have the opportunity of really delving into it by forcing you to answer some study questions so that you're all going to do well in the next exam. All right. Now, lastly, for work that we had to do for this week, so we can go into next week. I think one of the better ways of illustrating what's happening in the Cenozoic is by maybe looking at the evolution of a different sort of animal, genus Equus, the evolution of a horse. From henceforth, we're gonna delve so much in primates, we're gonna leave pretty much everything else behind. So this is our last shot to look at the evolution of a different form under the same sorts of pressures that primates were under. The evolution of horses is a guided tour of the evolution of horses throughout the Cenozoic. And you're going to learn some fascinating facts about how the horse has changed in some remarkable ways. And much of that had to do a lot with the climatic change and the appearance of flowering plants at different stages, different sorts of flowering plants. Now, one thing you want to think about when you're watching this film is that while horses were in the understory, beginning as browsers, fruit, and leaf eaters, they eventually emerged as grazers on the open savannas once flowering plants developed as grasses. But contrapunctually, where were we? We're in the different habitat. We're right above them in the upper story in the tree. So while all these climatic changes were affecting the horse, they're equally affecting the primates. I want you to think about in your head, how would primates be adjusting as the temperature and changes, all climate changes in the Cenozoic. Now, lastly, really what I want you to look to is precisely at just about minute 7.5. There's a continued discussion. We started talking a little bit about species and speciation, right? And then we talked previous to that about this idea of taxonomy, how organisms are classified. And two big words I threw out there to you, right? One is called the classificational system by Linnaeus, right? Which is there's no time dimension in it. The next is this idea of a cladogram, which is very similar to a taxonomy, but it shows individual relationships, all the way down between every single organism, right? But it also does not show time relationships, when these relationships occur, when this branching occurred, and speciation or families were changing apart, right? And the next and final form is a phylogeny. That's when everything comes together. We can show how things have changed, right? When they've changed. Is by anagenesis, by cladogenesis, right? When the animals split, where organisms split together, if are larger major branches or just speciation events, and tag them in time, right? So at minute 7.5, they're going to look at cladogenesis versus a phylogeny in horses. And when you see that, you can pretty much model that between every other animal in the world, or every organism that ever lived. It's the same basic principle. So once you see that, I think it'll come together. All right. So that's the work in which you have for the week up front of you. Again, any questions on what you have here, please just hit me up by email. I'm kind of sitting around all day going, where's these student emails? So just hit me up. Let me know what's going on if you have any questions, and we shall chat. Next material probably coming at you next Sunday or so. All right. Take care.